I mean, this is one of the few contemporary art exhibitions that's ever been at the Getty. So why did you decide to do it?
Okay, well, as you're implying and know, our collection and our collecting stops at 1900,
Right.
Except for photography, which we take up to the present day. Since we can't tell the story of 20th and 21st century art through our own collection, the only way we can do it and continue the narrative and not just have it stop dead as if 1900 was some major landmark in Western and European art, which it wasn't.
Right.
The only way to tell that story and to engage people with more contemporary interests is to do exhibitions,
Right.
which in selective and interesting ways take that narrative forward. So that's the general answer. So we'll be doing more of this sort of thing in the future, at least while I'm here. But why this one in particular? And we were approached by Tate about doing the Auerbach exhibition, which they had, a major retrospective of that
Just
artist
recently
in London. And I said, look, that's interesting and thank you, but frankly, our audience on the West Coast of the United States really won't know, other than a handful of collectors and art historians, won't know Frank Auerbach's work and how important he is. But what I would like to do, if you, Tate, are interested, is select a group of the most important artists of the so-called School of London, to which he belonged, so we can do an overview of why this was a very important moment or series of decades, mid to late 20th century, where a handful of British artists focusing on still the figure, landscape, representative art, why this was so important, not just as a British phenomenon, but influential and much admired, and indeed, in a sense, had influences well beyond the shores of Britain or Europe for late 20th century art. I'd love to do that sort of overview so that next time there's a retrospective of someone like Andrews or Auerbach or Kossoff, we have the framework in which our audience can put them and understand that importance.
But it happens so often with the contemporary exhibitions that they tend to focus on a single artist because you have participation of the artist's estate and the dealer, and it's easier to do. But the idea of doing what would one call this, a group show, an exhibition of artists, all of whom knew each other and were part of the same generation, a long generation, is an idea which is, I think, really important. And it's one of the problems I see in museums in Texas and on the East Coast as well, that the exhibitions of modern and contemporary art tend to be monographic too much, and that this works against it. And you begin wonderfully with the artist who is known the least of the group. And the artist who was an Englishman born in Norwich and worked with the human figure, but actually got to know others of the artists later on. And it's, to start with the unfamiliar, to me, is magical.
Well, and I think it'll be a bit of a surprise for people, because even those who think they do know the School of London, Andrews is less well known. Commercially, he's never had the success that Freud, Bacon, and some of the others did. But he was very central, both as a student of Coldstream and Freud in the early days, and then a colleague and friend of Freud, Bacon, and others. And he was, admired and seen as a central figure by all the other artists of the group. So we started with him because of that making that statement. And also, I think it's useful to have a name that is less familiar, that makes the point that these six, because we selected six artists, are not the whole of the School of London, far from it. I mean, there were some 20 or 30 when they did, the early group shows in Britain itself. And so these are the ones that have risen to the surface as the most important and prominent. But it's only the beginning of the story.
Right. And the works in this room are obviously engaged directly with the human figure and the landscape. I mean, this, glorious. Right. It could be in California in a funny way.
Exactly. It could be Santa Monica, but it's Brighton.
Yeah, but it's Brighton, and where are we? And it's both extremely accurate in a certain way, like an architectural drawing, and it has a total absence of the human figure. Yeah. And it's poetic and beautiful.
I think of the artists in this show, it's this space with these 6 paintings is the least, or let's say there's the most variety in approach. And that is true of Andrews's work. He didn't get into as much of a groove as, say, Auerbach did early on. and the whole career, and it's still going, is very recognizably that artist in that mode. With Andrews, there were these different modes and types of work. I find, looking at that, very precise, got a slightly surrealist feel about it because of the absence of the human figure or any presence. But very precise, and then these very painterly ones like the deer park.
I think maybe my favorite one is that touching swimming picture.
Yes.
It's really wonderful. Of course, what we're focusing on in the symposium that we're doing is not really so addressed by this room, and that is the issue of trauma. The notion that Britain suffered through all the horrible, the Blitz and all the terrible things, and London was really a city that was really brought to its knees in many ways by the war, and artists picking themselves up and actually reacting to the trauma and having a personal engagement in the trauma, which is much more obvious for Auerbach and Kossoff and the
even
other
Kitaj,
artists. And Kitaj,
exactly.
And not so clear here, even though in a funny way, I mean, just because you're British and you were born in Norwich and trained in England doesn't mean you didn't experience the trauma.
The only one painting which has, I think, a different type of trauma is this one of the man who suddenly fell over. There's the anguish of the woman behind him, and then him in this awkward pose, yet seemingly smiling. There's obviously psychological sort of ironies and oddities going on in this picture. It is much more psychological, I think, statement than it is anything else. But it's personal. It's interior and it's personal. It's not about a trauma of society.
Right, exactly. And the disparities of scale and the sense of motion. I don't even know whether does it come from photographs?
He did work with photographs, but I have no idea whether this one did in particular. There's the odd, but I think coincidental similarity to Mayol's sculpture.
Sculpture outdoors, exactly.
But well, I think that is an accident.
Yeah, there's also Ben Shahn and Goya. All these weird and disparate influences. Mm-hmm. We should look carefully at Auerbach because.
Yeah, I think Auerbach, the works you see in this room, and I think the representation of this artist more than any of the others has been, I think, the surprise to people how strong, how powerful, how interesting he is. We've had lots of collectors and artists. A lot of artists have come to the exhibition, of course, because it does engage with contemporary practice and the return to painting, which is an interesting thing about the times we're living in. Yeah. And these artists, more than any others, really deal with the qualities of paint. And they lay it on, as it were, with a trowel, and none more than Auerbach and Kossoff. But this, I think, has been a very strong and good representation of this artist, and I think it's had real impact. I think the strength of the imagery and just his handling of paint, both portraiture and landscape, both natural landscape and urban landscape, the rebuilding of London, it's a very interesting story, and it hasn't finished. He's still working every day.
That's incredible. The sort of visceral quality of the images, and the sense of the fact that they're almost still drying as you look at them.
I mean, I think there are paintings in this room and in the Kossoff room where the paint, if you were to scrape down to the core of it, it'll be drying for the next century. I mean, it's 2 or 3 inches thick.
Right, exactly. And put on not with brushes, but with other gestural tools. In fact, I have no idea how the paintings are constructed in this way.
Well, one of the remarkable things about both of them, they were close friends, Kossoff and Auerbach, and still are. They would both work largely from drawings, doing sketches, either outdoor on the landscape, for landscapes, or of course of subjects in interiors and so on, and then move to the creation of the painted work. And if they weren't satisfied with it, I mean, both of them had this way of working, which seems incredibly, in a sense, not exactly wasteful, but labor intensive and high risk. If they didn't like where they got to that day, and the paint was, of course, already half an inch thick, they would literally scrape it all off and start again the next day. And this went on not just for days, but for months and sometimes years. Yeah. You can't imagine, what were the bucket loads of paint that got tossed out each month.
Well, in the history of art, there are the scrapers and the adders, and like Degas is a scraper, and Manet is an adder, and you have an artist who will work with something, and then it forms an armature that can't be supported of the next next layer, and so
and you
take
can
it
understand why, when the paint is really wet and this thick, there's no way to sort of paint over it. You're just going to mess it up in this way if you try to put another layer of paint on. Just the application is going to make things just won't work. So it's in a way an understandable process, but it's such an extraordinarily high-risk process in a way.
Well, and the importance of gesture in some of these paintings, and I mean the painting that comes from Titian, I mean, unless you had the little photograph of the painting by Titian, there would be no way that you would understand. But it's not the Titian in particular that's important, it's the forces in the Titian, the interaction of the figures, the meaning of the gesture, and then the exaggeration of the gesture by the artist, which is, I mean, if you looked at that just utterly independently, you would have no idea that it had roots in the history of art.
And in a way, I think there's a number of aspects of Auerbach's work which are, in a sense, intriguing and sometimes seemingly contradictory. In that, as you say, with that is based on an old master, and yet it doesn't seem to be. But also the both representational abstract qualities, because although these artists all say, they're not abstract artists, they're very aware that they're the foil to abstract expressionism, which is happening at the time in the 40s and on to the 50s and so on. But yet, if you walked into the room and didn't know much about the artists, half of the paintings in this room could be thought to be purely abstract. Yeah. And I'm sure, they reveled in those, delighted in the qualities. I mean, they were clearly, obviously, Auerbach's aware of the abstract coloristic and gesturistic and compositional qualities they're creating, but they are insistent, and for good reason, that they're based on drawings and thinking and looking at real objects.
Yeah, and at real space, and in the city. I mean, the city becomes in this room and in the next room a kind of character. It's a part of the human drama of the city is enacted in these constructed environments, or environments which are buffeted by weather. And of course, the great English tradition of that is, is that lightning, or is that steel, or what is it? I mean, we're not, and funnily enough, when I look at them, I think that many of the abstract expressionists who we were always taught were abstract were actually not.
They claim, Rothko and others, who will say that they're actually representing real emotion and things that are real and indeed even concrete. And I must say, I was just in London a few days ago, and I went to the Abstract Expressionist show at the Royal Academy. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's been very interesting to see a great exhibition of what was exactly the alter ego to this show of abstract expressionism writ large, and then to be coming back and seeing this again. And there are these interesting links, despite each side of them denying, as it were, that they are purely affected by the other. Clearly they are.
Yeah, no. Everybody's reading the same magazines in the end, even though each city has its specialty. The other thing that's interesting about this, and that when I think about abstract expressionism, and I think about English art, and of course it was a foreigner who was born in Russia or Poland who wrote the book, The Englishness of English Art, Nicholas Pevsner, and we're in this room of an artist who was born in Berlin, and and many of the artists, in fact only 2 of the artists were born in England, of the 6 that you have. Bacon was English, but he was born in Ireland and raised in Ireland. And there is this sense of otherness, but then again, when you think of the abstract expressionists, they too, many of them it's the cosmopolitan quality of the city that draws the artist and creates a place where people who are not English or American can make art, can make powerful art.
Yeah, there's very much a sense that these were people who had either themselves refugees sent as children, from Germany, or as with Kossoff, descended of Russian emigres earlier in the century. But the sense that Britain was their adopted home, and in a way, of course, that made their engagement with the city and the place and the people even more intense, because they'd sort of chosen, it's the one that had given them refuge. So it meant even more to them, perhaps, than it would to a native.
Well, and making images of it that would not be recognized by a native. I mean, a proper middle-class Englishman in looking at these pictures would think, this is not London. This is not the city that I know, and yet it is. Yeah. It's a city perceived by another, and with an intense passion, the sort of the sense of emotion, and not suppressing emotion, but pushing it forward is what's really extraordinary. The 2 figure pictures on the end, I think that nude is one of the most powerful And that paint will never dry. I think it probably even, it looks like it even has bitumen in it. I mean, it's like lava coming
exactly.
down.
It is, yeah.
And this, whether the figure is lying down or sitting or the back or the front, I mean, as you confront it, the painting becomes a figure. It doesn't represent a figure.
One of the extraordinary things about a number of these artists, and Freud's another one, the number of sittings that they often went through, sometimes hundreds. I mean, Freud's mother sat for him more than 1,000 times in the portraits he did of her.
Wow.
And, multiple sittings for a result which looks almost abstract. It's the thought process and the actual working process of the artist is clearly a much more complicated one than normally with a portrait where you look at the person and the shape of their nose and so on. To end up with this after whatever it is, 10, 20 sittings is it raises lots of questions about the thought process and the working process of the artist
in a way,
himself.
the painting is almost an embodiment of the subject rather than a representation of the subject. So it becomes the subject even physically. In a way that's there's a lot of thick painting in the history of art, but very little that approaches this. And the artist who one thinks of most importantly is an artist who was a member of the school of Paris in the 1920s, and that's Soutine. And of course, Soutine has a very similar trajectory to Auerbach and Kossoff and Freud.
Yeah.
You've segregated the two thin paintings, I guess because they would look odd with thick paintings.
Yeah, they do. I mean, I think they play off each other nicely. They, as it were, form a unit. Whereas,
and they also play off with
leading into this.
These ones. Yeah, it's interesting.
The Andrews.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You see these representations of space, of urban space, and
even the palette. The palettes, frankly, work. So there's quite a few of these in the exhibition where we're obviously doing things aesthetically as well as in terms of a chronology or an arrangement to make a point. We wanted also to look good.
Right. Well, and because the rooms are not installed chronologically, they're installed visually.
Yeah. This is not, and we made the decision very early on, this is not, for none of the artists does this represent a real overview of their work. You can't, between 8 and 12 paintings, show the course of a 50-year career. So we weren't trying or pretending in any way to be comprehensive. It was about quality. We wanted works that, wherever they are in the artist's career, represent sort of high points of their achievement.
So you and the curator selected from the Tate's collection and then chose works to add to them.
We did, because it started as an exhibition we were doing just with Tate, but it became pretty clear that even Tate, particularly for about the last 25 years of some of the artist's career, didn't have works of consistently the same quality, whereas collectors who have been collecting for the last 20 years do, and some museums. We have the Art Institute of Chicago's, Bacon, for instance. So private collectors and others. So I'd say maybe 15-20% of the works are from non-Tate loans.
Non-Tate loans. And what's also interesting to me is that clearly the taste for the School of London, and I want to talk about the whole School of London idea later, has not really arrived in America in a big way. I mean, if I live in Dallas and we have huge representations of Italian, German, French, Japanese, American, and in Houston, Latin American art, but almost nothing of London, of English art from the post-war period. Yeah. It hasn't quite arrived in the United States.
I mean, I think Bacon and Freud are in a slightly different category than the other four in this show. In that certainly the names are known, their achievement is known, and even if collectors haven't collected them as much as you say, other Europeans, they're at least known and acknowledged. And they in New York perhaps are more represented than the rest of the country. There are some West Coast. We did borrow from some West Coast collectors who have collected Freud, Bacon, and some of the others, but you're absolutely right. They haven't become the superstars in collecting terms, and yet when they do sell a great Bacon, these are huge prices, and Freud's for huge prices. Yeah. So the market is recognizing their importance, even if the collecting is still more in Europe and in Britain than it is here. And the Europeans certainly, outside Britain, have got it.
Yeah. Kossoff is, I think, a great artist and represents more fully than Auerbach the experience of being a human body in the city. Being and his parents in a room, in the swimming pool, in the subways, and the walking down the street in the churches, and this. And I assume that this is a construction site.
Yeah, it's a building that's been demolished, and so it has its skeleton exposed. The figures clearly have a much more quality of people with emotions than ever they do in Auerbach's work.
Yeah.
Where, as you said, sometimes they're almost abstract, physically, in terms of structure, quite abstract. But with the portrait of his parents and some of the drawings, and even this man in the wheelchair, where the paint almost takes on the feeling of skeins of skin sort of falling off the bone.
It's as if he's being flayed by the artist.
Exactly. That could be a Mathews, for all you know, if you didn't know the title. But there is, in the character of the faces, there really is a sense of brooding and in some cases melancholy or suffering. So the people are real. They are emotionally charged in a way I think is less clear with Auerbach's work.
Well, and also you think more of Liebermann and Beckmann, of a German tradition of representation when you're in here. I mean, at least I do. This whole set. I mean, Liebermann is the first great German artist who used paint as paint, and Beckmann, who kind of looks at himself and at people and their situations in a way that's also filled with personal trauma. This is. I mean, when you look at you think, how am I going to paint a portrait of my parents? And I paint a portrait of my parents when they're old, when they're, non-communicating, when it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon or 3 o'clock in the morning, when they're in their little sort of wooden deck chairs and maybe in the backyard even, or a green carpet. And there's nothing about that is the way that they would want to look. No. It's not about how they would want to look, it's the way they are. And the way they are on a huge scale. I mean, the figures in the painting are probably larger than the people, as is the man in the wheelchair, if indeed it's a man.
I think also the church has you can't help thinking of the German tradition, the German expression, and even back to Die Brücke, the sort of structure, the diagonals of the architecture and all of that, the fragmentation.
Well, and the format of the canvas is a square, and the building sort of fits in it, topsy-turvy. If it stood up, it would go off the picture plane. So it has to move. And the idea of flux, that everything is constantly in flux, and nothing is fixed, and there are no contours. I mean, even these big, thick contours become independent lines. It's not that they play this is a fascinating wall because the pictures on the side and the picture in the middle deal so differently with the human figure, yet they're each the same artist, and they each deal with paint in similar ways. So you've got the city in here, the subway,
buildings, railway sites, building sites, a church,
Yeah, I mean, it's a whole. Kossoff is born in London, and his father was a baker or something to Russians. I mean, I think of the importance of immigration to London, both after the First World War and the Russian Revolution, and then after the Nazis in the Second World War, and this huge influx of people who played an enormous role in the creative
intellectual life
of the city. So the painters are actually part of something that's not just about painting. That's about a larger social forces and phenomenons, and the way of dealing with it's not the London that you go to when you go take photographs as a tourist. There are no palaces. It's the gritty London,
the underground.
It's the gritty London, and in a certain way, it may be what makes these paintings really particularly difficult. I mean, I can only think of one artist who painted the Paris metro, and that's Vuillard. And the Vuillards those paintings are almost unknown. And there's not, the artistic representation of Paris and the artistic representation of New York tends to be of what you want the city to be. And here it's the way that the city is, by inhabitants who have nothing, who are not part of the...
And even regardless of subject matter, the French tradition of the 20th century maintains a sort of attachment to prettiness.
Absolutely.
Which this is, in a sense, never trying to be that. It's trying to be the gritty and almost the ugly made interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I gave my 3 lectures on beauty, and you wouldn't use that word easily in any of these rooms. Really, it's not there in the sense of pretty beauty, in the sense of beauty as being something nice. I mean, there's almost nothing, the bodies aren't nice, the situations aren't nice, the colors aren't nice. There's no decorative quality whatsoever to these pictures. And so to have them where you look at them every day is something which is a kind of an emotional journey for an owner or a viewer. For me, the wheelchair picture is just haunting and
I agree.
terrifying in a sense. And that the British, of course, defined the beautiful, the picturesque, and the sublime. And the sublime terrifies you. And there's an element of the sublime, of something fearful that's deeply human, that isn't natural, like the sublime of the 18th century.
Should we go into Kitaj?
Yeah. Exhibitions need to have a didactic component. You need to leave with the notion that you remember these artists, and you know how Kossoff is different than Auerbach is different than Kitaj. And this installation does that. It's very powerful. I remember seeing, I don't know when it was, maybe it was in the 70s, the Kitaj exhibition that was at the Tate and at the Los Angeles County Museum. And I remember this torrent of criticism about Kitaj then. And I remember wondering why there was this torrent of criticism, why he was so interested in words. I remember these huge labels on the walls with texts and things that were not, we've been taught to think that modernist painting has nothing to do with words. The words come after the painting, not before the painting. And the artist's mind is not of such interest. And to me, that exhibit, I saw it in LA actually, and it was really powerful. I think maybe some of these pictures were in it, though I can't remember.
Because they are pretty well all Tate.
Well, and from the point of view of our audience in Dallas and the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies, the whole Kitaj was born in the United States, and he was an American, and he was a person who went to England and became an English artist, and then recovered his own sense of his Judaism through his life, and begins to use his art as a way of coming to terms with that in a way that really isn't English or American or anything. There's another sort of level of identity art that's going on.
And nowhere more explicitly than in this painting of the wedding, where you've got him with the yarmulke, and then Freud and Auerbach, and then David Hockney in the background.
The rabbi at the very edge, or maybe his father.
Or even maybe him again, I'm not sure.
It is the tiny bride.
She's almost totally in the background. So it's all the community of artists who are part of his life, but very explicitly, that they're wearing yarmulkes and so on. So
in the context of a Jewish wedding, in the context of his rethinking of his own relationship to his religious traditions, which are traditions that he had, as I understand it, sort of suppressed and then recovered later in life, and using art at the service of it. To me, the interesting thing to me is that his palette is much more French. It's much more attractive and decorative and conventionally beautiful than the other artists, and he doesn't succumb to this sort of gray and beige continuum, and with colors that aren't saturated. I mean, there are lots of oranges and reds in Kossoff and Auerbach, but they tend to be very deep and dark. Rather than bright and coming to the surface.
It's also, he's the artist of this group who is the most, as it were, representational in his figures. You can recognize in these faces who the artists are. It'd be quite a challenge with any of the others to say who the person is from the painting itself.
Well, the painting has to tell you who the person is, whereas in this room, it's really true. And so you have him represented with 6 works of art.
And then a few, there's the paintings in there, but with paper. So we do have some other, as it were, sort of paintings and semi-paintings in the other room, pastels and so on. But also with him, there was the influence of pop art and other things, which
Right.
were very, which really, frankly, wasn't any part of Kossoff, Auerbach, and the others, which you see, and sometimes even, as you were saying, lettering in the work,
Right.
and using photography, but with a very different effect in his work than
Then
with
it-
someone like Bacon or,
Right.
or even Freud.
To me, if one were to rewrite at the beginning of the 21st century the history of 20th century art, there would be an enormously large and neglected figural tradition that would go throughout the century and would be in a kind of dialogue, even in the United States, with abstract art. And we tend to think that these artists, I mean, if you think of German art, it's exactly the same way. I mean, virtually every German artist is in some way figurative. And the Japanese use the body in their dealings with things. The most abstract of the artists are the Italians and, in some senses, the Americans, particularly but there is a huge underground tradition of representational painting throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century, now with digital imagery, where we use images, we seize images very powerfully.
It was, to some extent, sort of just suppressed in the writing of the history of the century, but it was, as you say, it was always there. But it was also, I think, for at least the first half of the century, the suprematism towards French art.
Yeah.
Picasso being the exception, but for...
And then Dutch and Russian abstraction, which comes in, and with Mondrian moving to New York
But
all of
figurative
that.
art never really died.
No.
It just took different forms in different places.
I have a vision of a huge survey of 20th century figurative art in a gigantic museum where one actually confronts it, not as a tradition, but as a series of pathways. And you think of, and Alice Neal would look great in this exhibition. And she worked in New York at the same period of time, and her work was completely suppressed in the history of art until recently because she didn't fit.
Yeah.
And the artists who didn't, these artists fit because they're with each other. I mean, the group makes something more powerful than any of the individuals.
Yeah, but how much of it in a textbook written about 20th century art, say in the 80s, how much of this would have been in it? Virtually
None
nothing.
of it. Virtually nothing.
Yeah.
Maybe Bacon.
Yes, exactly.
At that period of time. The other interesting thing about them is they have so many figures, and they create these narratives which are not like religious narratives and sort of genre scenes they deal with like multiple people of both genders and different ages all together, and standing in front of them, you really have to spend a lot of time just decoding them and sort of figuring out what they're about. I mean, I started studying this when I came through rapidly the first time, and this man they're obviously in a public place, but he's in a recliner, and there's somebody with a knife, and there's a woman who's fallen down, and there are all of these things that really don't add up to anything.
They're fragments of different experiences and things he's seen, and they are pulling a bit like Bacon did famously, images from all over the place, and himself. It is an arcade, a book arcade, and there he is reading a book. But that's the only bit of the narrative that makes sense. That's the only, the rest of it, all the figures and so on, they really are, fragments drawn from other experiences or.
And then this
whatever.
Wonderful blazing white. It's almost like a Chagall or something with those late pictures. This is the earliest one, I think, and in a way, I think that when he's thin and patterned and doesn't actually respond to his paintings aren't about his own gestures, they're weaker. These, I think, are very...
And the pastels in there are wonderful.
Yeah.
I think he's also wonderful with pastel.
This is the first painting. This is fascinating. He painted it when he got to Oxford. And you can see him, who are these figures? Are they manifestations of one figure? Are they all different figures? What sort of interaction? What are the flowers doing in the lower left-hand corner?
And then the title, throwing Erasmus in there. So we're supposed to try and decode what are the elements that actually relate to Erasmus, or do they not? Is that just a sort of an illusion?
His illusions, in the criticism of the 1974 or whenever it was show, were that the illusions were pretentious and that they were fake. I mean, they were like grace notes in a Baroque symphony. They didn't add to the structure. They didn't have real meaning. And of course, in a day when illusions are so easy because of the web and because of finding things, that no one would accuse somebody of being glib as he was accused of being glib.
And we're used to it, much more used to it now.
Yeah, we're much more used to it now. What's the decision to have to segregate the works on paper aside from conservation?
By putting the drawings together, it allowed us to make the point about certain relationships between the artists, ways in which they perhaps influenced or affected each other, in ways that with the paintings themselves, since each has a room to each artist, you don't get that. You get an immersion in each artist in turn, but you're not highlighting relationships. So this is a room where we decided we could do a bit of both and tell a slightly different story.
Well, you can go from a Kitaj nude to a Freud nude
etching,
to and you can see the preparatory drawing for the painting by Kossoff of his parents and.
Yeah.
The Getty has the tradition with Kossoff because, of course, he did that exhibition and book on Poussin.
Exactly.
And I remember seeing it too. I went through with Tim Clark, and who of course wrote about it. And the idea that a contemporary artist can grapple really with a great old master artist rather than suppressing it. I mean, the idea that there's this long continuum in representational art history, and that artists look at works in museums that are not contemporary. And that's why, in a certain sense, this exhibition is so appropriate for the Getty, because you can go into the normal galleries and find things that could have inspired.
Exactly. And I must say, that was something we've played on and made a point about, that this is a show about a major episode in 20th century painting, but it's by a number of these artists had very meaningful, real interest in the history of art. And their work was at times not just influenced by, but a reaction to the work of artists like Titian, as we saw with Auerbach and Poussin. For others, so it's not, as it were, a different 20th century art isn't a different story from the story up to 1900. It is continuing the dialogue, which of course all artists have with their predecessors.
And which is the importance of living in a museum city. I mean, great cities have great museums, and great artists look at lots of works of art that aren't just by their friends. And the sense of that is that's why it's important that there's contemporary art at the Met, in addition to the modern in New York. I'm fascinated with one tends to think of etchings as being things that are done after and in a room, but you're recording something that was already done, what you're doing.
As in the 16th, 17th century. But for these artists, it's not.
They're done from life, absolutely. They're independent works, and the model was sitting in front of him when he was making the etching, just like she was when he was making a painting or a drawing. I find that one of the elements that always disturbs me is the contrast between so-called early Freud and mature Freud, because early Freud, though it is involved with identity, it's so carefully done and so beautifully designed and so elegant, and then he just throws it out the window. I mean, you go from that to that, and you can't imagine this artist doing that. But it's the same artist.
Doesn't it make it more, it's a bit like early Titian, late Titian,
Absolutely.
isn't it? I mean, when you have a career that length and an artist who's that focused on and as it were, developing his art in interesting ways, and I think that makes Freud just all the more interesting.
I agree. There was an exhibition at the Fort Worth Museum of Modern Art, which you may even remember, of Freud's portraits the way through. And it was a fascinating exhibition because we don't tend to group works of art by portrait, landscape, still life. We put them by artists. And so this was an exhibition that dealt with him looking into the eyes and at the heads and bodies of particular people. And I was riveted by it, and it forms a kind of substrate as I walk through this exhibition and thinking, what is a portrait?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's clearly, arguably the most important figure painter of the late 20th, early 21st century, and a large body of that figure painting is portraiture.
Absolutely.
It's, I think, an amazing and a remarkable achievement. I think this work, this Kitaj, is worth looking at. It's, I think, both purely aesthetically, a very compelling work, but of course it brings all the subjects and his investigation of his, Jewishness, and it's about fascism, the ugly figure in the middle and the black cat. But what a powerful work. I mean, it is a painting, it's a pastel, but effectively It has all the qualities of a painting, and what a draftsman too.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't see it in in so much in the other work, but what an incredible draftsman. There's elements that Degas wouldn't have been ashamed of these figures.
Not at all. Well, and the eerie
the
thing
bathing of the bather, yes.
Yeah, and of the overt eroticism and of this complete otherworldly. I mean, she and she don't seem to have anything to do with each other, but it's the same she.
Yeah.
It's very powerful, and the funny semi-erotic photograph of teenagers, and I mean he's getting at so much. But this wall of these heads, and then those landscape drawings is unforgettable,
isn't it? And I think the Auerbach drawings are extraordinary. I think particularly the self-portrait. And he worked, again, it's like the paintings. He'd go back and back to the point where the paper itself got destroyed. So he'd end up pasting on these sort of Band-Aids of paper and then drawing over them again. But I mean, I find it absolutely, it's almost got a photographic quality when you stand back.
Oh, absolutely.
From it.
You think that there's a photograph in the background somewhere.
Yeah, but of course it's absolutely not that. But it's got I think this has a wonderfully haunting quality to it.
I mean, I would run off happily with the landscape drawings. I think they're incredible. And when you see them in the catalog, I mean, one of the problems with publications is that even if you read the dimensions, you don't think them. And so the compaction of them, in the sense of these gestures are wrist gestures, whereas in the paintings they're elbow and arm gestures. They go to the next, and how to capture the intensity of those lines. I mean, there is so much energy. It's like electricity, because I guess some of them actually do represent lightning.
Yeah.
And then if one thinks of a painter who almost never represents women.
Yeah. And maybe it started as a man. We don't know.
It started as a man. Yeah. I had in my college at Yale, the master of the college had a screaming pope in the living room. So when I was even 18 years old, this image of the screaming pope, and why would a pope scream, and what is it? And it was those kind of scraped styles.
Yeah.
This is just so
and
powerful.
Great portrait.
Incredible.
I mean, I think there's no one who, as it were, abstracts the features of a person's face more than Bacon, and yet somehow it's still recognizably that person when you see the photograph. It's almost uncanny.
Yeah. Even though it's, again, the play of gender in both of these, because you wouldn't at first think it's a woman.
Yeah.
But then you think of the dress and the hair and everything, and it's a genderless. I mean, this is also in a funny way
genderless body. Yeah.
It's genderless body.
It's a blob almost.
Yeah, it's a blob that's been violated, and the sense of violation. And then of resemblance, which is what you point out in the portrait.
And the faces look like they've been through a meat grinder too. I mean, everything has been violated. The physicality of the person has been violated in everything he does. Can we do the early wall? Yeah, because this, I mean, to me, that is one of the most terrifying paintings I've ever seen. And it has those sort of suppressed gestures, the gestures that rather than being expressive are almost pulled in and nervous. And then the void at the center of it, and you realize that the void is the back of a coat, that the figure is absent. And it's, it has, and then there's this strange machine-like material sitting on the table next to the figure, and that ham-handed hand. It's just, one is supposed to be looking at somebody of enormous power and importance, and that person is gone. It's a representation of absence. But the menacing sort of aura of the situation remains somehow.
It must be Dad. It must be Grandpa. I don't know who it is. I haven't read about it, but just looking at the painting, and looking even at that sort of strange little turquoise sky that doesn't really help us. And this, this is from the 30s.
Exactly.
It's from the 30s.
This is a very early work. We look at these two paintings and think about how would Bacon have seemed to someone looking at him, let's say in 45 when this one was done. The only box you could have put him in would have been surrealism. And yet, ironically, he was rejected from the British Surrealist show as not being surrealist enough.
Yeah, but Penrose didn't like them.
But that's, how could you see this painting and not think that it is a surrealist image?
But looking in retrospect, you see everything that comes later right here.
And but that is to say that there is a surrealist feeling about his work right through, even though he moves much more to portraiture and other things. But these works, I mean, this triptych again.
I saw the exhibition of triptychs by Bacon at the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow years ago, and it had 8 triptychs in one room. And it was simply, I mean, the room was so powerful and so terrifying that you almost couldn't stand in it. It was, what's haunting about them is that they're actually graphically and chromatically very beautiful and very balanced. And then you get into them. I mean, for me in this room, the great thing is the bicycle. I think it's
Absolutely, because it's a bit unexpected,
Yeah.
and it's a painting that's not as well known. This is one of the loans not from Tate. This comes from the Brettell Museum, and I was, really pleased to get it. I think also for anyone who's ever tried to be a painter, I think one of the things that Bacon draws as a teenager, for me, it was just what he did with paint. The magically mysterious, somewhat surrealist images he created, and did things physically with the paint that you couldn't understand how he made that happen. That's why I think for many of us as teenagers, Bacon was your favorite painter.
Yeah.
How could it not be? It was sort of alluding to a world that you didn't quite understand. It didn't really need to, but on an aesthetic level and just for its weirdness, it just drew you in.
Well, and to me, the power of this room is it has every kind and scale of painting in it. So that Bacon, I mean, just seeing Bacon triptychs is too much. If you see one Bacon triptych and then 2 small portraits and then a genre scene of George Dyer on a bicycle and then early paintings and then this just...
Yeah, the Screaming Pope.
But of course, I remember when the picture was acquired, it made sense in Chicago because Chicago had such a powerful surrealist tradition. And the city was, the museum of the city could accept this image, haunting and mysterious and terrifying as it is. And of course, he grew up in a Catholic country. I don't know whether the Bacons were Catholic.
Don't remember
Yeah,
either.
I mean, it's because this, of course, raises the issues of the body and death and authority and, and the church in such powerful ways. Lee Bowery.
Yes.
I mean, this is good because you have one wall of early, and then doing this is great, where you see this sort of ghost with closed eyes. And the idea that it's William Blake, the man.
And a Bacon portrait of Freud before you move into
Right.
The room of Freud. And again, it's this, particularly from the profile of the nose, that's Freud.
Yeah.
And yet, how can you? It's so distorted. It's hardly got any mouth, it hasn't got any eyes, and yet somehow it comes together as a portrait of Freud.
Yeah. It's these two, and the man who is such an other in the pantheon of English artists, who fits nowhere. It's the...
Exactly.
Blake would not fit into the Englishness of English art.
Now, the Dyer on the bicycle, again, it's partly what the magic he's able to sort of spin with the actual paint, the blobs, which then become smudges, that then become eyes and cheeks and other things. But also it has a dynamism to it. A lot of his work is the blob sitting there.
Yeah,
it's somehow
it's
distorted,
stationary,
but it isn't, it's stationary. This has a sense of movement, which is, I think, unusual for him, but it's such a wonderful image.
And the multiple wheels and the sense of an impending accident. And I haven't figured out this green thing down below in its link. It's one thing I can't figure out, but it's good to have things that one can't figure out. And then the painting is so thick that that there's lots going on, in subterranean levels.
And he's created this rather thick and textured brown layer to the background, which is unusual. Normally they're really quite
flat.
smooth and flat, and
Yeah.
it's all about the figure, the contrast with the figure. But here there's a grittiness to the paint too.
Well, you've let us end with...
Well, we left, of course, Bacon and Freud to the end because, in a way, they're the two most familiar figures. They're always talked about in the same breath. They're the ones who, rose to prominence in a way none of the others, quite have. Although, Auerbach in particular, I think, is getting there. So it was the obvious thing to do, but I also think it provides the crescendo that the exhibition needed.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right. I'm not all that wild about the big color photograph that you see at the same time as paintings, but it's because this room, this wall is just unbelievable. I mean, it's funny that that tiny painting, it just screams at you from the corner. It's unbelievable. Mm-hmm.
And I think a wall of it, for a wall of early Freud, you could hardly have anything better than this and this. But also starting with the boy smoking, which was a part of Simon Sainsbury's, and now been bequeathed. Yeah, and it's you see it in the catalogue, and of course, in fact, it's enlarged, which frankly it shouldn't have been. But the size of it, the power it packs into that tiny, it's the size of a postcard.
Yeah. Well, there are two Freuds on this box wall, one by Bacon and one by Freud. And then the mother, I don't know, that's not him, obviously.
No, that's a boy he'd painted a number of times, but he was just a sort of a kid near his studio.
I mean, it's, because these are...
But emotional stuff. There's also nothing's more loaded with psychology than Freud's portraits, and none even right from the beginning. When you see this, the prickles of it sets up that tension. There's some anxiety here. There's there's the sideways glance, and in a sense the same thing with the portrait of his wife next door, seemingly strangling the cat. And we know that put these two together and the marriage is in trouble, which it was, of course.
Which it was, of course. And then the sort of such an incredibly frank acceptance of the human body as it is, with its fat and its knobby knees and its... I mean, I remember the first time seeing that portrait, and what I did immediately was to try to stand like that, to see what it was like to stand like that. It's like not a ballet position. It's this kind of awkward position where it's hard, actually, to maintain it, and you're sort of hoping that he's leaning up there. And then what is that? Is it a skylight? What is above?
And of course, Bowery was a performance artist, so his life was about his body and his performance. So it's not an accident that he's able to stand that way, perhaps unnaturally the way would be more awkward for us.
Well, in the sort of study of breasts, 1, 2, 3, each with a different kind of eroticism and reality, those huge, his tiny head on that enormous body.
He's a colossus, and of course the perspective, looking up at him makes it even more so. I mean, it's a extraordinary painting, and I do think all the nudes in this room. Yeah. I don't think who else in the late 20th century has produced a body of work like this.
I mean, our only painter of nudes in the same, who does more or less the same thing as Pearlstein. And of course, the paintings are boring compared to this because they're so flat and so ungestural. There's not...
And unpainterly.
Yeah, what you have here is an engagement of the painter with the subject, because the painter is remaking the subject out of paint, and you feel that as you see it. Yeah. And then these poses that are so unusual and have no precedence in art history. I mean, sometimes there's that one painting that he painted after Watteau, in which the figures are posed like Watteau figures. You'd have to look at the most bizarre Baroque figures to find. Yeah,
there's a contrived awkwardness to them. I mean, you're saying, well, if someone just would lie on a mattress, as the woman is and the man is there, there's no way they would lie in those poses. He's obviously said, well, turn your head this way and then move your, tuck your knees up this way. It's obviously uncomfortable. Yeah, but clearly he likes that tension from a pose which, well, sets up a sense of something going on.
Well, it also sets up a sense of instability. Like you can't be like that for very long. Yeah. You can't hold.
The only natural pose is the dog.
Is the dog.
That's the way a dog, because
But
you can't tell a dog what to do.
But it's falling off too.
Yeah.
So it's, you know.
But dogs do that.
It's just held. It's held to the, and then this incredibly simple, elegant portrait.
Yeah,
I don't
and
know.
He's deep in his thought. He's not looking at the artist. The artist does not want him to be.
Yeah. It has this marvelous tonal subtlety.
And the actual way the paint is laid on for the jacket and the clothes and so on, it's often quite thin here, and he reserves that crustiness for the actual skin,
right?
Which with people of a certain age is the way it begins to actually be.
Yeah.
But it's also in his later work. The skin, and on the nude here to our left, also the same thing, almost over it all. There's this incredible crustiness to the skin. Which is both repulsive, but also meaningful, and it's part of the it's part of the quality of the work.
And it's almost an act of painterly adoration. I mean, you can't get your brush off of her. The brush is and the idea of these beautifully painted empty shoes and then no feet.
Yeah.
So, and something that you want to be horizontal is vertical. All reclining nudes are on horizontal canvases, I mean, virtually. And here he's even playing with that. And this hideous, you can imagine the bugs in the mattress. But what power in this room. And starting with the early, which are haunting and have a reserve about them, about the way they're made. And then he begins to have courage to make in the way that he sees.
I think the second portrait of Kitty with the dog is, it's sublime.
It's a total, complete masterpiece. That's true. It's interesting. The exhibition has this way of it starts with the unknown. The middle is this artist who doesn't quite fit, Kitaj, with all of his colors and everything, and then you come to this sort of thundering conclusion. And remembering each of them, I think, as I walk out the door, I'll want to put in my mind a memory of each room. But there's this wonderful book called The Memory Palace of Matteo Ricci. Have you ever read it?
No.
It's about this Jesuit priest who goes to China, and he's afraid he's going to forget European civilization. So he creates a building in his mind in which he puts his memories so that he knows how to get to them. And this exhibition with these rooms that exemplify an artist at the highest level, that are not complete, they're like a little beginning taste of the artist. It has the same kind of power with drawings in the middle. It's really, I think it's really important.
Well, that's a nice way to think about it.
I wish that all of the people who will be in the symposium listening to us chatter away could be here. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It's